Hello, what does it take to retain and to grow major client accounts? One of the most important questions facing any large B2B organization. And at a time of downturn, this becomes even more critical because clients will decide who they want to stay in the room, who they trust. Now, the businesses I'm involved with really focus on the skills of clarity, storytelling, trust building behaviors as a way of achieving this. But what if you could also add real science to the process and what's more, apply military techniques to the challenge of building these critical accounts? Well, that's what we're going to hear about today. And with me is Dan Connors, who's one of the co-founders of the Applied Influence Group, and they do exactly that. So we're going to do a deep dive about 15, 20 minutes. Dan, thanks for joining me. Thank you very much for that. Could you just give a quick overview of what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're a specialist influence consultancy, and we define influence as the ability to change how people think, how they feel, and how they act in a way that aligns with your goals. We learn what we know on high-stakes military intelligence operations, where we had to influence some really challenging stakeholders. And we now take some of the thinking and processes that we learned on an extended period in countries like Iraq and Afghanistan to help organisations engage better with their customers and to be able to influence their business outcomes. And we do that in two ways. We help individuals get better at that, building skills in listening, planning, how you communicate. And we help organisations plan better influence strategies. And we believe influence is a team sport. And that's about maximising every interaction that your organisation has with a client to work towards a common goal.
Before we get into the detail of that, how can you take what you do in the field in a military environment where you're dealing often with the enemy, you're trying to it's obviously that situation, to a business environment where you're trying to collaborate, win hearts and minds and so on? How do the two relate?
So I think a lot of military planning methodology is about answering the right questions. And I don't think in that situation, it matters whether it's a military context or whether it's a business context. It's about being able to answer those questions as a team so that you go into a situation with a really good understanding of what's going on, being really clear as an organisation and as an individual about your role to play in that, and then having some common frameworks that you can apply so everyone's working from the same knowledge base, with the same kind of approaches to how they plan their interactions and carry them out, so that you've got common language and approach to maximise the sum of your parts.
Okay, so how do you do it? Well, give me an idea of what that looks like in practice.
So for building an influence strategy, we go through a process of helping our clients answer a series of questions like, what's the situation that I'm trying to influence? Which might sound fairly simple and something that, well, of course, your team knows what the situation is that you're trying to influence. But whenever we go and work with organisations, we find that individuals in the sales team are working off different assumptions, off different knowledge, some of which may be wrong and may be known to be wrong to other members of the team. So trying to provide a common operating picture to start off with, trying to be really clear about what the objectives that you're going after are. And some of those objectives will be simple things like, we want to win this deal, or we want to grow this account by this percentage. But what are the things that you need to do to make that happen? And are you aligned on that? So are you agreed on who the key individuals that you need to influence are? They will often be within your customers' organisations, but maybe within your own organisation. And trying to get alignment at the most senior levels within your own organisation, trying to leverage other people in your own organisation can be really key. So understanding who you need to influence, who's best placed to do that. It's not always going to be the sales leader. It might be someone involved in the delivery, possibly at a fairly low level, who has regular interaction with certain stakeholders. So being able to answer that question, who's best placed to do it? And then managing, how do you manage that process overall at a time that everybody that we work with is trying to do more activity than they have hours in the day. And very few organisations we find create enough time to think and plan and do that as a collective.
Can we just start where you started? Because I think that's such an interesting opening, this kind of discovery and seeking to align people. My experience over many years is there's an utter lack of alignment often in any team. Even I've worked with boards of directors, and you ask them all the same question, all in theory running the same business together as a team. You ask them the same basic questions, and they give wildly different answers. And we have an analogy that if two airplanes take off from the same runway, but they're 1 degree apart, and they just carry on the same line, guess where they end up? On different continents. So if you haven't got that alignment at the beginning, if people aren't pointing in exactly the same direction and understand what that is and have agreed what that is, then of course you're going to waste a lot of, well, actually, to use a military analogy, I imagine you're wasting a lot of ammunition firing in the wrong direction. So I can see how that works. I mean, if you go back to a military situation, how critical is it to gain that clarity of objective in there, and how do you then use techniques from that to help people in a business environment do the same thing?
So there's a concept in kind of military operational planning called mission command, which is the idea that you should always know what your 2-up's intent is. So, if you're operating at a battalion level, you should know what the brigade and what the division is intending to do. And the idea behind that, and that trickles down as well, is that if you know what's trying to be achieved at a higher level, you can always operate in alignment with that, regardless of the situation that you find yourself in. So it means that if I know what my boss is trying to achieve, and I find myself in a certain situation, I might identify opportunities in that moment that I can think, well, actually, I know what the overall goal is, and that allows me to operate, alongside that. And that works at all levels within the military, and works off the basis that if I understand that, I can change in the moment how I react. And that's exactly what we're really seeking to get across with business clients, is that no interaction with a client stakeholder will ever survive the first 5 minutes of your plan going into that meeting, because people are people. They'll come in with their own agendas. They'll have access to information that you don't. So the situation will, as you're interacting with people, will constantly dynamically change. And if you understand what the intent of your team is, then you can react to that and operate in a way that's going to achieve those goals. Okay,
so that makes sense to me, and as I say, it really resonates with me because of the work I do in gaining clarity and alignment and focus. What next? So we now are all pointing in the same direction. Brilliant. What changes next? What are the military lessons you've learned into, as it were, into the field where we're seeking to gain, retain, grow major strategic accounts?
So I think you need to have a common language and frameworks to talk about the people that you're engaged with. So we have a way of building a rich profile of a key stakeholder so that you can understand the type of person they are and therefore the message that might land with them. You can understand what are the things that they feel really strongly about, and therefore you can either avoid those if you're going to go head to head, or maybe work with them if it's something that you're aligned on. Having a common understanding of their preferences, whether that's a preference for how they communicate, how they receive data, or even minor things like how they take their tea and coffee. Having a common kind of view on that is the quickest way to build strong, durable relationships, and again, be able to maximize that resource, which is the knowledge that you've got in your own organization. So applying common thinking and a way of doing it means that individuals who are really good in your team, naturally influencing, have got a way of explaining to people who aren't naturally as gifted at it what it is they're doing and why they're doing it. Allows those who aren't a way of tapping into some of that experiences from people who maybe naturally do some of these things.
So if I can just mirror that, because I always say to people, particularly when building strong narrative, start with them, not you, which is the same idea, of course, which is to say, let's start with the people you're trying to target, what their agenda is, what they care about, what matters to them, and then work backwards and obviously match your strengths and capabilities, and particularly where you're really, really great, with those needs. And that's when you start building a powerful story. But what I'm interested in is how you get the data. So there's one thing to ask people, what are these, let's draw a map of your customer base, for example, this account. So that's a classic traditional account management, isn't it? You've got a map of the terrain, if you like, the people you're trying to engage with. What else is, in terms of, if you like, science comes into this, where you might use data to change the way you engage with people?
So I think data we just say is information. And I think there's probably a difference between kind of the analytics kind of data that might come from a system that's kind of pulling in specific information about who's clicking on which bit of a website, and the less kind of structured data that you might get from thinking about people. So our start point would be, what is it that you know about those individuals as a team? And again, individual pieces of information are often siloed in individuals' heads, and teams are very, very poor at leveraging what they know. Donald Rumsfeld, back in the heady days of kind of the first Iraq conflict, talked about there being the known knowns and the unknown unknowns. But the bit that he missed out in that fairly famous quotation is he didn't talk about the unknown knowns. And that's what we often find when we start working with organizations, is there are lots of data points, lots of bit of information about key stakeholders that exist within the team, that people have in their own brains, that they have based off the interactions that they've had with individuals, that they can draw out. There are then things like beginning to look at what is the type of information that these individuals are pushing out. So increasingly you see senior stakeholders, particularly post-COVID, virtually everybody has now done a webinar, often where they're talking about their strongly held beliefs about their particular sector or something that they do. That's another useful data point that you can start to draw information from. And it's then about how do you kind of build that into a common picture and apply some kind of framework to what is often very subjective data, and how do you differentiate between what are specific known facts and what is opinion, and being really clear with people about which falls into which category.
That's really interesting. A company that we work with, IntraHive, would provide a lot of that information, actually, that information about the terrain, what you know and what you don't know that you know, which I find interesting. I think where you and I are different here is that I believe and that you can actually help some of those who are weaker at some of those influencing skills and trust building skills, as I would call them, to be better. Not necessarily as good as the best, but at least the aspiration should be that everyone approaches these accounts with a consistency, even harnessing their own strengths, which may not always be high levels of charisma, or there may be other strengths they have, but that the intention and the approach and the open mindedness, the open questioning and so on is present. And I see you nodding at that, so you obviously agree.
I totally agree, and kind of from my military time, I worked both operationally, managing people doing this operationally, and in a training role. And I actually found that there were often kind of two schools in the training environment. There were those who were kind of natural communicators who could walk into a room, have an amazing conversation with some individuals, but maybe weren't particularly very good at planning what they were trying to do and how they were going to go about doing it. And then there were some of those who were maybe less naturally gifted as communicators, but who could plan well and execute on the plan. And it was definitely the latter category that were more successful. So I totally agree that you can improve people, you can work on their skills. I think there are some people who do just form natural connections with people really easily, but it can be a challenge with them to apply an actual kind of methodology about how do you plan for interactions to maximize the benefits from those natural talents.
I love that. I suspect you and I fall on different sides of that equation. Maybe. Just briefly on this one, if you can, because I want to get to we've only got a few minutes left. Where do businesses go wrong in your experience when you start working with a client, or when you're talking to prospects and so on? Where are they going wrong in this area?
So one of our first corporate clients was one of the largest technology companies on the planet, and one of their senior sales advisors, sort of internal consultants, attended a program that we ran. And towards the end of it, he gave an observation that what that business was doing a lot of shooting and not a lot of aiming, and that's really what they needed to change, that they needed to do more aiming and less shooting. And that kind of touches on something that you sort of said a bit earlier in this conversation. And I think that applies fairly universally. I think it's got worse during COVID, that people's calendars now are so jam-packed, jumping from call to call, that people don't stop to spend a little bit of time planning, thinking about what it is that they're going to aim at, and then shooting at it accurately. And I think it's, that vast amount of activity that people do can often end up being not necessarily totally ineffective, but it's not an efficient use of time. And investing a little bit of time up front with your team as a collective, thinking about what you're trying to do and how you're going to go about doing it, is something that all the businesses that we work with struggle with.
Dan, that's so powerful. I love that. And we call this spear fishing rather than net fishing. So rather than casting a big net and catching, and you get a load of tiddlers in that as well as some of the big fish, but there's a lot of wastage. If you spear fish, you only get the big fish, right? And I think that's such a powerful point. There's so many people just doing stuff. Their diary is so full, they're too busy. That Kevin, one of my partners, shared a brilliant cartoon of a medieval battle scene, and the guy is busy firing his bows and arrows, and someone's trying to show him a huge, great cannon that he can use. I haven't got time to look at that. I'm busy fighting a battle, And I think that's so often true. Getting people to focus on what's really important, on the clients for whom they are the best fit, and who are the best fit for them too, is such a productive use of time. But as you say, people don't want to lift their head up from the screen often to do it. Okay, so that's great. But as we come towards it, what would be your big takeaway? So if I had one idea from listening to you, talking to you, that I should take away, what would that be?
Influence is a team sport. And I think that often gets lost. It's often viewed as something that some individuals are good at, some are bad at, but trying to identify how you can maximize as a team, as a collective, how much influence you've got, where you've got it, and how you can make the most use of it, is something that doesn't happen enough. So influence as a team sport would be my key takeaway.
Again, I'm nodding vigorously. There's one of these discussions where there's huge agreement. And I love everything you said. If I could share a takeaway that relates to this too, which is that better data and even brilliant insight in itself changes nothing. It's what you do about it. It's the behaviors that change as a result of the new information that matters. It's such a bleeding obvious point, but usually things that are obvious aren't necessarily what people do. Yeah. So listen, Dan, thank you very much for this, and I hope we get to work together as well in the field.
Thanks very much. Really enjoyed it.